Welcome back to our third week in our Evidence of Easter series. We're about 2 weeks away from Easter, and like we've been saying through this whole series, Easter is the singular reason that you either should or shouldn't be a Jesus follower. I mean, the thing that caused the earliest followers of Jesus to believe that Jesus was God wasn't his teachings, it wasn't his miracles, it wasn't even Jesus' death on the cross. It was the resurrection. You see, if the resurrection never happened, if Jesus never rose from the dead, then he's not God. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, if the resurrection did happen, then Jesus really is God. And you and I should devote our entire lives to following him. Now, if you've missed the first 2 weeks of the series, I'd encourage you to go back and watch those messages. But today, I want to start by asking you, did you grow up going to the Sunday school? Like for me, that was my story. I grew up going to Sunday school, and I heard the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. But as like a little kid, in order to talk through the crucifixion with me, in order to help me understand it, they gave me one of these like beginner Bibles. And this Bible is awesome. There's pictures and all kinds of great stuff in it. And so as a little kid, this is what helped me understand the story of Jesus. And it helped me understand the crucifixion. But you see, for me, because of my upbringing, growing up, knowing the story of the crucifixion, but only knowing it from this Bible, every time somebody talked about the crucifixion of Jesus, this was the picture that would come to mind. That anytime I would hear about Jesus being crucified, I would imagine this picture. Now, hear me. This is the perfect way to explain to a little kid the crucifixion of Jesus, right? This is such a helpful way and an age-appropriate way to explain Jesus' crucifixion to a small child. But the problem for me was that as I grew up, as I got older, I held on to this picture. This was still the picture in my mind of the crucifixion of Jesus. And so as I got older, as I got a little bit more mature, the story of the crucifixion became disconnected from my real life. Because in my head, the crucifixion was just a cartoon religious story. And it wasn't real life. Now, maybe you've had a similar experience, but for me, that was how I understood Jesus being crucified. It didn't mean much to me until a movie came out in 2004. And in this movie, what they did is they took the historical evidence of what crucifixion actually is and turned it into a movie about Jesus, walking through Jesus' crucifixion in a more historically accurate kind of way. This movie was called The Passion of the Christ. And for me, when I watched that movie, it completely changed the way I understood the story of Jesus' crucifixion. And as I watched that movie and I learned from it and I grew, I began to study and dig into more of the historical evidence of what crucifixion was. And again, the more I realized what crucifixion is, the story of the crucifixion became less and less a cartoon to me. And more the story, a historical story of what the person I call God actually experienced. So today, as we walk through the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, what I want to do is I want to actually help paint a more grown-up picture of what crucifixion actually is. But I want to give you a little bit of a warning, because the reality of crucifixion is messed up. It's absolutely horrific and brutal. In fact, back when crucifixion was happening, they didn't have a word to describe how gruesome and painful crucifixion was. And so they actually had to make up a new word to describe the horror of crucifixion. If you've ever heard of the word excruciating, the word literally means from the cross. But that's how gruesome and horrible crucifixion actually is. So I want to just let you know that if at any time during this message it just becomes a little bit too much for you, I want you to pause this message and jump ahead to the last 5 minutes. All right? You have my permission, and I invite you to do that. So let's begin our story. So last week we left off with Jesus being flogged. And here is what happens next. In Luke chapter 23, starting at verse 26. It says, as they led Jesus away, a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, happened to be coming from the countryside. The soldiers seized him and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Now, let me pause here and just paint a picture of what's happening. Now, crucifixion wasn't this like isolated, just the criminal and a Roman soldier leaving. Crucifixion was all about public humiliation. So every time a crucifixion would happen, what they would do is they would gather the town, they would gather the people and say, come and see the criminal get their justice. And so people would come from all around, and what they would do is they would have the criminal carry their own cross to the place where they'd be crucified through the town and through all of these people who would mock them and spit on them and ridicule them as they walked. Now, more often than not, when we see a picture of Jesus carrying his cross to the place where he'd be crucified, we see him carrying like this in the entire cross, right? In reality, if you're looking at like the historical evidence, it's really unlikely that they would have actually carried the full cross. Because most crosses weighed upward of 300, 400 pounds. You can't do that. You can't carry that. And so what historians talk about is that it's more likely that they would have carried the crossbeam of the cross. And so in this scenario, you can picture Jesus walking through the crowd, right? After being flogged, after being ripped open, torn open, bloodied, with this giant beam, 100 pounds on his back, trying to carry it to the place where he'd be crucified. Now, what you need to understand is that it's not like the Roman soldiers would carve out a brand new cross every time somebody would be crucified. They would reuse them. And crucifixion, when somebody was crucified, it's not like you would be crucified and minutes or hours later you die. You'd hang on the cross for days. You'd hang on the cross for days and you would bleed and you would be spit at. And if you had to use the bathroom, you would go right there. But the cross would become filthy. And you see, what is more likely is that Jesus would have carried a used, filthy beam on his torn open back to the place where he would be crucified. Now, what we understand actually, not from the scriptures, but from church history. The way church history would talk about this is that as Jesus carried the beam, the way that the story goes is that he would have fallen kind of onto his face, and the beam would have landed on top of him, kind of squishing him into the ground. Although that's not like in the scriptures, I believe that's true. And I'll explain why in a minute. But what we see in the story is that Jesus, because he was flogged, because he was torn open, because he was experiencing so much pain and had been exhausted from being flogged and from being awake and going from trial to trial, that there was just no way he could carry the cross to where he would be crucified. And so the Roman soldiers, they pulled this guy named Simon to carry the cross for Jesus to where he would be crucified. And the story picks up from there. It says 2 others, both criminals, were led out to be crucified with him. When they came to a place called the Skull, they nailed him to the cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right and one on his left. Now, how this would work is that once you would carry your cross to the place that you'd be crucified, Roman soldiers would assemble the cross and then lay the criminal on the cross. And the criminal's arms would be held out, and they would put nails through the hands or the wrists and through the feet. And that is what would be used to hold you to the cross. And then the Roman soldiers would lift up this big cross into a hole in the ground where it would fall and hold into place. Now again, in most of the pictures that we see about crosses and Jesus on the cross, what we see is Jesus way up in the sky, right? But again, historians say that more often than not, that's not how people were crucified. Instead, they would be crucified and hang at eye level with the crowd. Again, this is about public humiliation. And so what would happen is that they'd be crucified at eye level and people would be able to come and mock the criminal to their face, could spit on their face, could slap their face. The idea that you would be at eye level so that everyone else could look you in the eyes and humiliate you. All the while, the criminal knew that when they looked down, they would see that their feet were just inches from the ground, just inches away from freedom. Now, what we need to understand, too, is that when you're crucified, you don't die from bleeding out, right? You're on there for days. You don't die from starvation. When you're crucified, you die from suffocation. Then what would happen is that as you try to hold the weight of your body up with your hands and your feet, the nails pierced into the wood, that eventually your body would just get too exhausted. And eventually, you would suffocate under the weight of your own body. Now, as you were suffocating, to add to the humiliation, to add to the excruciation, the criminal would be able to look down, knowing that 3, 4, 5 inches away, they'd be able to put their foot down on the ground and take another deep breath. That moments away, just inches away, was their freedom, was their ability to live. And so Jesus is crucified along with these two criminals. Now what happens next blows my mind, because this is what Jesus says. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." After all the humiliation, after the brutal flogging, after carrying a cross all the way up to be crucified, after being nailed, after all the excruciation and humiliation, the thing that is on Jesus' mind, the thing that's on Jesus' heart, is forgiveness. There's so much power in this moment. But we're going to come back to this in just a minute. I want to keep reading the story of the crucifixion to us and help us understand what is happening in Jesus' crucifixion. So it says, the crowd watched and the leaders scoffed, the religious leaders that were there. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he really is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers mocked him too by offering him a drink of sour wine. They called out to him, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." And a sign was fastened above him with these words, "The King of the Jews." Even one of the criminals besides Jesus hanging said, "So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself and us too while you're at it." I mean, again, I want you to put yourself in Jesus' shoes here. That he's crucified and all of the religious leaders are there mocking him. The crowd is standing around him mocking him. That the Roman soldiers are there mocking him. That even one of the guys crucified next to him would mock him in the midst of Jesus being crucified and hanging on the cross. But the other criminal protested. "Don't you fear God even when you have been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes. But this man, he hasn't done anything wrong." Then the criminal said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise." And in this moment, this other criminal, he owns up to his own guilt and yet proclaims Jesus' innocence. And in this subtle kind of way, declares Jesus to be God, declares Jesus to be his Lord. And Jesus says, "You will be with me in paradise today." Jesus receives the criminal into his kingdom. What a beautiful moment. It says, "But by this time, it was about noon, and darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. The light from the sun was gone, and suddenly the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn down the middle. Then Jesus shouted." This is going to be important. Jesus shouted, "Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands." And with those words, Jesus breathed his last. And when the Roman officer overseeing the execution saw what had happened, he worshiped God and said, "Surely this man was innocent." And when all the crowd that came to see the crucifixion saw what had happened, they went home in deep sorrow. But Jesus' friends, including the woman who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching. Now, not to get caught up in the emotions of what's going on here. Again, I want to paint a picture of what's really happening. Because if you were to do the math here, it's not that Jesus was hanging for days on end, right? He was hanging on the cross for just a few hours. So what's going on? How did Jesus die if he was just hanging for a few hours? Well, in other places in the scripture, what we're told is that the other two criminals, that their legs were broken, that the Roman soldiers would break their legs, the idea being that they could no longer hold themselves up and they would suffocate faster. But they didn't do that to Jesus because he was already dead. But he'd only been hanging for a few hours. Well, in other places in the scripture, what it says is that the Roman soldiers, they took a spear and pierced him in the side. And the point of this is that they would go through the side and try to pierce the lungs and the heart. But what's so curious about this is that the way it describes it, when you get somebody with a spear and pull it out, you'd expect blood to come out. But the scriptures say that blood and water came out. I mean, I get the blood, but what's with the water? Well, do you remember back when I said how church history describes Jesus carrying the beam on his back and falling forward and being squished, right? Do you remember that? While he's carrying his cross up to the place where he'd be crucified. Well, scientists have actually dug into this and done some experiments. And what they found is that to fall and be squished by this 100-pound beam on your back, it would be the equivalent of getting into a car accident at about 60 to 80 miles per hour without a seatbelt or an airbag. That the amount of trauma that your insides would face when you hit the steering wheel at that speed would cause your heart and the area around your heart to rupture. And similar to how, like, when you rub your hands too hard, you get a blister, in a similar kind of way, the heart would have began to flood with water. You see, when Jesus shouts, "Father, I give my spirit to you," this isn't a man suffocating. This is a man knowing that he's only got moments left to live. And I absolutely believe that when they pierced his side, what it was is that the water would be flowing out from the heart because it was flooding, because it was ruptured. That Jesus shouts because he's having a heart attack, because Jesus is dying from a ruptured heart, that in a very real and literal way, Jesus dies from a broken heart. You see, for you and me, when we read the story of the crucifixion, what I want you to hear and what I want you to know is that Jesus didn't go to the cross not knowing the weight of what he was carrying. That Jesus went to the cross with a broken heart. That Jesus would be willing to die with a broken heart. That what Jesus accomplished was with a broken heart. And as everyone else looked in and saw that this was not an ordinary crucifixion, That even this Roman soldier overseeing the whole thing, who'd likely seen hundreds of other crucifixions in his life, he looked at this moment and said, surely something was different here. This man was God. Now we got to ask the question, right? What does this have to do with the resurrection? And there's two things that I want to point out. The first of what this has to do with the resurrection is that Jesus really did die. He really did die. There are people who would try to argue against Jesus' crucifixion by saying, well, he just passed out, right? He just fell unconscious. But I'm telling you, with the amount of trauma that Jesus faced, he didn't just fall unconscious. The scriptures are clear. The evidence is there. It is overwhelming. Jesus died. He really did die. The witnesses saw it. His side was pierced. Jesus was dead. That Jesus really did die. The second thing that I want to point out is what Jesus spoke in the midst of the entire crucifixion. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. That Jesus would offer forgiveness in the midst of all of this. While everyone else would look on and say that they were not interested in his forgiveness, Jesus was still interested in theirs. And you see, if the resurrection never happened, if Jesus never rose from the dead, then Jesus isn't God. And if Jesus isn't God, then all we have is the forgiveness of some random guy from 2,000 years ago. But if the resurrection did happen, if Jesus really did rise from the dead, then he really is God. And if Jesus really is God, then the crucifixion shows us that there is no amount of evil, there is no amount of violence, there is no amount of bullying, there is no amount of being mistreated, there is no amount of betrayal or injustice that you could commit that God wouldn't still extend his forgiveness to you. That if the resurrection is true, then the forgiveness of God should change everything. If you're listening to this and you are, if you're a Jesus follower, the forgiveness of Jesus, it has to transform you. It needs to transform you and me to becoming the most forgiving people on the planet. That when you get mistreated and hurt, you extend forgiveness. Not because the person deserves it, but because you and I, we take our cues from Jesus. And Jesus shows us that there is nothing that can't be forgiven. That Jesus shows us that if you want to find true life, if you want to extend real love, if you want to find real freedom, you must freely forgive. And if you're watching this and you're not a follower of Jesus, maybe something like the crucifixion is the thing that you've been hung up about, then today I want to invite you to cross the line of faith and to say yes to Jesus. To say, Jesus, I believe that the crucifixion is real, that you really did die, and that if you really did rise from the dead, then you really are God. And I'm going to devote my entire life to following you. So today, if that's you, I want to invite you to say a simple prayer. Jesus, I give you my life. And from this moment on, live in relationship with him. If that's a decision that you're going to make, I want to invite you to comment below. And I want to reach out to you and help you take your next steps in this journey of faith through the rest of your life.